In the year 1354, the world stood on the brink of chaos. Imagine a time when the future of an entire century hung in the balance, swaying between the forces of peace and war. This was no ordinary year. It was a year when the fate of Europe was decided by a few powerful men, and the lives of countless people hung in the balance. The sound of the infidel, the Turks, was pounding at the gates of Christendom, and the Pope, Innocent VI, was desperately trying to bring about a settlement between the warring nations of France and England. But would his efforts be enough to stop the bloodshed? Pope Innocent VI, an aged and sickly man, saw the threat of the Turks as more pressing than the ongoing conflict between France and England. The Turks had just seized Gallipoli, a crucial gateway to Europe, and the Pope feared that the Christian world would be unable to unite against this new threat if the war continued. He pressed the kings of France and England, Jean and Edward, to negotiate a permanent peace. Both kings, however, were hesitant. They were pressed by their empty treasuries and the growing discontent of their people, but neither truly wanted to end the war. For Edward, the war had become a drain on his resources, and the English people were tired of the endless fighting and the high costs. In 1352, Parliament had even limited the king's power to conscript soldiers. When the House of Commons was asked if they desired a treaty of perpetual peace, they responded with a resounding aye, aye. On the other side, King Jean of France was trapped by his own fears. He was worried about an alliance between Charles of Navarre and England. Charles, his son-in-law, was known for his conspiracies and had already caused trouble for Jean. To make matters worse, Charles was hostile, and Jean's ability to raise troops and taxes from Normandy was limited. Jean was forced to swallow his pride, cancel the confiscation of Charles's Norman fiefs, and pardon him for the murder of Charles d'Espagny. In a ceremony of reconciliation in March 1354, the two men embraced and swore oaths of loyalty, but the tension between them was palpable. Despite the Pope's efforts and the apparent willingness of both sides to negotiate, the year 1354 saw a series of failed attempts at peace. A treaty that seemed overwhelmingly in England's favor was nearly signed, but at the last moment, France refused to accept it. The truce was extended for only 1 year, and the war resumed. Charles of Navarre, always seeking an advantage, began to treat with Edward, promising to meet the English at Cherbourg for a joint campaign. When Pope Innocent VI learned of this, he accused Edward of conspiring against the King of France. Edward, a skilled liar, denied the charge, but the evidence suggests otherwise. Determined to renew the war, Edward began to prepare his forces. He raised funds, secured the support of Parliament, and assembled a fleet of men and provisions. On Midsummer's Day, when the truce expired, 2 English expeditionary forces were ready to sail. One, led by the Black Prince, headed for Bordeaux, while the other, under the Duke of Lancaster, was bound for Normandy. The Black Prince, Edward's 24-year-old son, was a strong, imposing figure with a full mustache. Known for his haughty demeanor, he was destined to become a legendary figure, the flower of chivalry. However, his reputation would be tarnished by the brutal tactics he employed during his campaign in 1355. His objective was not to conquer, but to wreak havoc and plunder. Over the course of 2 months, his forces laid waste to the beautiful and rich land of Armagnac, burning towns, farms, and vineyards, and slaughtering livestock. The devastation was so severe that the French saw him as cruel in manner, and the proudest man ever born of woman. The Black Prince's raid was a display of military terrorism, designed to punish those who had returned to French allegiance and to deter others from following suit. The English burned and pillaged, sparing no one. They stormed and burned Montgiscard, where many civilians were killed, and spent 3 days plundering Carcassonne. Despite the presence of Marshal Jean de Clermont and the Count of Armagnac, the French offered little organized resistance. The Count of Foix, a powerful lord in the region, remained neutral, having reached a deal with the Black Prince that spared his lands from destruction. The Black Prince's forces returned to Bordeaux laden with loot, but the campaign had a dark side. The violence and cruelty against unarmed civilians were far removed from the ideals of chivalry that the prince and his knights were supposed to uphold. Froissart, a chronicler of the time, wrote, "It was an occasion for pity, acknowledging the moral ambiguity of the Black Prince's actions." Meanwhile, in the north, the Duke of Lancaster, known as the Father of Soldiers, prepared his own campaign. A veteran of 45 years, Lancaster was a distinguished warrior who had fought in countless battles, and even joined crusades against the Moors and the heathens of Prussia. In 1355, he joined King Edward in Calais, where they landed on November 2 with a force of 3,000 men at arms, 2,000 mounted archers, and about as many on foot. Their goal was to seek battle with the King of France, while raiding the regions of Pas-de-Calais, Artois, and Picardy. King Jean of France had issued a general summons to all men between the ages of 18 and 60, but the response was poor. The French host that Jean led north to meet the English was incomplete, and the campaign was marked by a series of missed opportunities and strategic blunders. The French and English armies circled each other, each issuing challenges that the other declined. Jean's strategy was to burn and carry off provisions from the countryside, depriving the English of supplies and causing suffering among the local population. The English, facing a shortage of food and drink, were forced to retreat to the coast. The campaign of 1355 revealed the deep divisions within France. The king's government was mistrusted, and the burden of taxation fell heavily on the Third Estate, the common people. When the estates of Languedoc, northern France, met in Paris in December, they agreed to support 30,000 men at arms for 1 year, at a cost of 5 million livres. However, they insisted that the funds be administered by a committee of the estates, not the king's treasury. This was a significant challenge to royal authority, and it foreshadowed the growing tensions that would lead to rebellion. The restless scheming of Charles of Navarre added to the instability. He was trying to turn the Dauphin, the heir to the French throne, against his father, and he was encouraging the Norman lords to resist paying taxes to the king. This would eventually lead to further conflict and rebellion. The year 1355 was a turning point in the 100 Years' War. It was a year of missed opportunities, brutal campaigns, and growing discontent. The efforts of the Pope to bring peace had failed, and the war would continue to ravage Europe for many more years. The actions of the Black Prince and the Duke of Lancaster, while successful in their immediate goals, had long-lasting consequences. The violence and cruelty they inflicted on the civilian population poisoned the 14th century, and the legacy of the war would be one of suffering and division. In the end, the year 1355 serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of war and the moral compromises that even the most celebrated figures of the time were willing to make. The chivalric ideals that were supposed to guide the actions of knights and nobles were often ignored in the pursuit of power and glory. The war that began in 1337 would continue for over a century, and the lessons of 1355 would be felt for generations to come.